We shall commence this module by discussing the Cambridge Capital Controversy. The Cambridge Capital Controversy, sometimes called the two Cambridge debates, refers to a theoretical and in part mathematical dispute during the 1960s, mainly among North American and European economists, concerning the nature and role of capital goods in standard neoclassical models, particularly those of economic growth. The Cambridge Capital Controversy also contained a critique of the dominant neoclassical vision of aggregate production and distribution. So in this module, we will focus on the criticisms of the neoclassical economics as put forward by English economist John Robinson. Robinson was aided in her project of debunking the myths of neoclassical economists by her able colleagues at the University of Cambridge in England, namely Piero Sraffa and Loic Bisnetti, famous names in their own rights. John Robinson and those in agreement with her argued that the economic theory behind neoclassical growth models was flawed and logically bankrupt and worse, largely irrelevant to the real world practices. And her criticisms do not fall on deaf ears. In North America, many professional economists, including some of the original creators of the neoclassical growth models, took it upon themselves to defend the theory against the Sraffian attack on the fundamental conceits. Paul Samuelson, Robert Solow, Frank Hahn and Christopher Bliss are the major names associated with the defense. Some of the important contributors to the defense were situated near the town of Cambridge in Massachusetts, US. It is for this geographical synchronicity that this debate is sometimes called the two Cambridge debate. These criticisms of the neoclassical models of growth and the debate, the critic endangered, have today come to known as the Sraffa-Robinson critique or the Cambridge Capital Controversy. The heart of the matter can be stated rather simply, and major elements of the debate are often explained as being part of the aggregation problem. Robinson summed up the critique of neoclassical capital theory by saying that it suffers from the fallacy of composition, which arises when one infers that something is true of the whole from the fact that it is true of some part of the whole or even of every proper part. In the realm of economic theory, the fallacy implies that we cannot construct macroeconomic or growth models which merely magnify the image of the micro universe and present that as the model of the macroverse, we cannot simply jump from microeconomic conceptions to the macroeconomic ones. Mere aggregation or summing over of individual production processes undertaken by myriad individual producers does not deliver an understanding of the production by society as a whole. This is the gist of the aggregation problem outlined by Robinson, though by no means is her criticism of neoclassical economics limited to this. The aggregation problem itself applies at different levels to the neoclassical framework. At one level, it applies to the nature of capital itself. In order to know what capital is or even how it is to be measured, economists have delineated two types of capital flows. The first considers capital to be what it really is materially, which is an incredibly diverse set of heterogeneous machines, tools and gadgets. Palm Pilot, small or humongous like a dam, widely varying in functionality and the intent. Secondly, the aggregation problem applies to the neoclassical notion of production function. We have seen in the preceding lectures that these generally belong to the CRS or constant elasticity of substitution family of production function, such as the Cobb-Douglas. The fallacy of composition is committed whenever we wish to lead our argument from a particular case to the general one, and every aggregate production function which attempts to combine particular and individual production processes into an economy-wide function between inputs and output is guilty of the fallacy. But the Cambridge capital controversy is not significant only because of the lasting impacts of the dispute on the direction and manner of economic theorizing. It is also important in the history of economic ideas because of the emotional and ideological weight of the debate. This is due to the fact that the Cambridge UK side attacked parts of the neoclassical theory that are fundamental to the framework. Accepting the critique would imply having to reject almost the entirety of the received theory at the macroeconomic level, which is why those at Cambridge US fought so valiantly to repel the critique. Across the clusters of capital controversy, this tension generates three recurring issues. Number one, explaining factor prices as a scarcity index. Number two, the methodological issues, integrating capital and time into equilibrium models. And number three, the role of vision ideology in fueling controversy when results of simple models are not robust. After studying this module, you shall be able to know about the Cambridge capital controversy, learn about the aggregation problem, and understand the neoclassical response and the Sarafa's contention. Now we shall discuss the aggregation problem. In neoclassical economics, we use a production function that is often assume the form of a CRS production function, for example, a Cobb-Douglas or a Leontief or AK type. We typically represent this as Q is equal to A into FKL, where Q is output and A is factor, representing technology. K is the sum of the value of capital goods and L is the labor input. The price of the homogeneous or single type output is taken as a numeraire so that the value of each capital good is taken as homogeneous with respect to output. Different types of labor are assumed to be reduced to a common unit, usually unskilled labor, measured in numbers of man hours of this unskilled labor. As we know to be the case with any neoclassical production function, both inputs have a positive impact on output, with diminishing returns to factor at the margin. So long as we leave this specification as is, with homogeneity among all units of output and inputs, we will encounter none of the aggregation problems that occur when we wish to make our models more complex. But in more complicated general equilibrium models, which assume labor and capital to be heterogeneous and measured in physical units, various problems begin to arise. In most versions of the neoclassical growth theory, for example, in the Solovian growth model, the production function is assumed to apply to the entire economy as if it were one big factory. In reality, of course, there is no economy-wide production process, only a multitude of relatively small individual production processes encompassing an incredible degree of diversity in the form and function of each process. But the vision of an economy-wide universal production function is important since it produces a core proposition of the orthodox textbook neoclassical economics, which is that the income earned by each factor of production is equal to its marginal product. Thus, with perfect product and input markets, the return divided by the price of the product, or say capital, can be used to equal the marginal physical product of capital. A second core proposition is that a change in the price of a factor of production will lead to change in the use of that factor. An increase in the rate of profit associated with falling wages will lead to more of that factor being used in production. The law of diminishing marginal returns implies that greater use of this input will employ a larger marginal product, ceteris paribus. Since an individual producer gets less from adding a unit of capital than is received from the previous one, the rate of profit must increase to encourage the employment of that extra unit, assuming of course that firms are interested in profit maximization. Despite the value of making the assumption about homogeneous units of capital and labor and assuming a universal production function for the entire economy, doing so leads to various problems. The first of these is the measurement problem, which is part of the aggregation problem. In the 1960s, the cluster of debate led by Sarafa and John Robinson, whose work set off the Cambridge controversy, pointed out that though we could get by using a notion of homogeneous unskilled labor measured in man hours, there was an inherent measurement problem in applying the same notion to capital. Capitalist income or profit fund is defined as the rate of profit multiplied by the amount of capital, not to be automatically equated with the rate of interest, which is the cost of borrowing capital, but the measurement of amount of capital involves adding up quite incomparable physical objects, adding the number of tables to the number of motor cars, for example. That is, just as one cannot add heterogeneous apples and oranges, to simply add up dissimilar units of capital could be absurd. As Robinson argued, there is no such thing as leads, just steel spelled backwards. An inherent element of each capital good that could be added up independent of the pieces of those goods. In other words, capital has no simple analog to the notion of purely unskilled labor counted in man hours, which is a technical measure for labor. Thus, Sarafa and Robinson argued that seen in purely material or physical terms, it was not correct to entertain notions of some homogeneous, summable measure of capital. We would need, in fact, as Wicksell noted in 1911, a separate category for each distinguishable type of capital good. The prospect of being unable to mount a unified treatment of the role of capital roused a response from the neoclassical side, and with Sarafa's refutation of this neoclassical response, the Cambridge controversy was well underway. Now we will understand the neoclassical response and Sarafa's contention. The neoclassical economist on the Cambridge US assumed that there was no real problem here. They said, just add up the money value of all these different capital items to get an aggregate amount of capital while correcting for inflation effect. This essentially means that the solution in the mind of the US economist was to consider the financial way of conceiving capital as the correct way. But Sarafa pointed out that this financial measure of the amount of capital is determined partly by the rate of profits. This is a problem because neoclassical theory tells us that this rate of profit is itself supposed to be determined by the amount of capital being used. Clearly, there is a circularity in the argument. If falling profit rate has a direct effect on the amount of capital, it does not simply cause greater employment of it. In general, the distribution of income along with the rate of profit help determine the measured amount of capital rather than being solely determined by that amount. Moreover, even if all capital units are measured in money terms and can thus be easily summed, even then the price of a sum of financial capital varies with interest rates. Sarafa suggested an alternative aggregation technique stemming in part from Marxian economists, by which a measure of the amount of capital could be produced by reducing all machines to a sum of the dated labor from different years. A machine produced in the year 2000 can then be treated as the labor and commodity inputs used to produce it in 1999, multiplied by the rate of profit. and the commodity inputs in 1999 can be further reduced to the labor inputs that made them in 1998 plus the commodity inputs multiplied by the rate of profit again, and so on until the non-labor component was reduced to the negligible but non-zero amount. Then you could add up the dated labor value of a smartphone to the dated labor value of, say, an automobile. However, Sraffa then realized that this more accurate measuring technique still involved the rate of profit. The amount of capital depended on the rate of profit. This reversed the direction of causality that neoclassical economics assumed between the rate of profit and the amount of capital. Further, Sraffa showed that a change in the rate of profit would change the measured amount of capital, and in highly nonlinear ways. An increase in the rate of profit might initially increase the perceived value of the smartphone more than the automobile, but then reverse the effect at still higher rates of profit. This is the problem of capital reswitching. The analysis further implies that a more intensive use of factor of production, including other factors than capital, may be associated with a higher, not lower price of that factor. According to the Cambridge UK critics, the analysis is thus a serious challenge, particularly in the factor market, to the neoclassical vision of prices as indices of scarcity and the simple neoclassical version of the principle of substitution. Another route to understanding the problem begins with the recognition that neoclassical theory assumes that both individual firms or the sectors and the entire economy fit the Cobb-Douglas production function with constant returns to scale. That is, output of each sector I is determined by the equation yi is equal to ai ki into alpha into L1i minus alpha, where a is a constant representing technology and know-how, k is supposed to represent the stock of capital goods assumed to be measurable, and L is the amount of labor input. The coefficient alpha is supposed to represent the technology for the sector I. The problem is that unless we impose very strong mathematical restrictions, we cannot say that this Cobb-Douglas production function for sector I plus 1 for sector J plus that for sector K, etc. adds up to a Cobb-Douglas production function for the economy as a whole, with K and L being the sum of all of the different sectoral values. The restriction is this: for the sum of Cobb-Douglas production functions to equal a Cobb-Douglas, the production functions for all of the different sectors have to have the same values of A and alpha. In a 1966 article, the famous neoclassical economist Paul Samuelson summarized the re-switching debate thus: the phenomena of switching back at a very low interest rate to a set of techniques that had seemed viable only at a very high interest rate involves more than esoteric difficulties. It shows that the simple tale told by Jevons, Baum-Bavak, Wicksell and other neoclassical writers, alleging that as the interest rate falls in consequence of abstention from the present consumption in favor of future, technology must become in some sense more roundabout, more mechanized and more productive, cannot be universally valid. The neoclassical economist Christopher Bliss has put forward an opinion that well summarizes the attitude of the US side concerning the capital controversy and therefore bears presentation in full. He states what one might call the existential aspect of capital theory has not attracted much interest in the past 25 years. A small band of true believers has kept up the assault on the capital theory orthodoxy until today. I shall call that loosely connected school the Anglo-Italian theorist. No simple name is ideal, but the one I have chosen indicates at least that the influences of the Piero Sraffa and John Robinson in particular are of central importance. Even in that case, there is a flavor of necrophilia in the air. If one asks the question, what new idea has come out of this Anglo-Italian thinking in the past 20 years? One creates an embarrassing social situation. This is because it is not clear that anything new has come out of the old bitter debates. Meanwhile, mainstream theorizing has taken different directions. Interest has shifted from general equilibrium style, that is high dimensional models, to simple, mainly one good models. Ramsey style dynamic optimization models have largely displaced the fixed saving coefficient approach. The many consumers that Stiglitz implanted into neoclassical growth modeling did not flourish there. Instead, the representative agent is usually now the model's driver. Finally, the exogenous technical progress of Harrod and most writers on growth from whatever school in the 1960s and later has been joined by numerous models which take technical progress endogenous in one of the several possible ways. Moving on to discuss the other associated criticisms, that is path dependence, history and equilibrium analysis and the mathematical formalism. In the last section, let us briefly acquaint ourselves with some associated concerns of the controversy. Three lines of criticism are commonly discussed today in reference to John Robinson's contribution to the two Cambridge debate. The first criticism concerned the ahistorical or timeless nature of the neoclassical growth models. A typical neoclassical model of growth has no real conception of time in the sense in which time is commonly understood. Robinson called this the question of logical versus historical time being time as we normally understand it, one directional and ever flowing, while logical time is what she once famously called mythological ages, time not as it is experienced but time as it is intellectualized, used in analysis which can go backwards and not only forwards. In a sense, Robinson's whole insight on the matter can be summed up in her observation that the way time is incorporated or brought into most neoclassical models suggests that it is very much like a spatial or geographical index. Robinson argued that most neoclassical models happen to use time as the type of spatial subscript. The time indexation could easily be mistaken for a geographical one. The economy between the time t is equal to a to t is equal to b could be seen as a transition between two geographically separated economies, one at place A and the other at place B. This confusion between time and place is precisely because time occupies no special category in economic theory of the neoclassical favor and beyond, causing discounting effects. An associated criticism was the issue of path dependency. In logical or mythological time, each passing second is independent of the time that comes before it. In real time, however, the contents of a particular point in time are heavily influenced by the content of previous periods of time. This is exactly why we intuitively understand a statement that says nations with a colonial past may have different outcomes after effecting the same policy parameters as advanced countries without a colonial history. We understand that the present carries forward much of the baggage of the past. The present comes to us, as a poet once said, shrouded with the past. Though Robinson began to make this criticism early on in her career, only recently has the wider profession of economics begun to explore the notions of path dependency in economics. The importance of history and path dependence leads to another criticism that Robinson highlighted. This criticism was Robinson's fundamental attack on equilibrium analysis, especially in the so-called dynamic growth models of Solow and his followers and intellectual inheritors. She claimed that since the workings of or the events in the real economy were sequential rather than simultaneous, equilibrium analysis based on the mathematics of simultaneous equations could never adequately describe processes of change and growth in the real world. If the hope was to be able to gain insight into the behavior of the actual complicated economy. Therefore, it was her claim that value and importance placed on equilibrium analysis is misplaced, and that it is in fact irrelevant as a tool of analyzing a historical world. Moreover, on the subject of the stability of these irrelevant equilibria, she argued introducing parametric shocks from outside the model to analyze what would happen to the theoretical universe was completely artificial. This, she said, was a patently false method of proving stability of equilibria, the whole enterprise of which is, at any rate, but an error in methodology, a confusion between comparisons of the imagined equilibrium position and a process going on through history. Her third line of criticism was focused in arguing against the trend in her time of increasing use of mathematics in economic analysis. In all this, she appears to be quite Austrian in her disregard for hard mathematics, almost to the point of being a Luddite. It was her belief that in economics, logic could be expressed more fruitfully with languages rather than mathematics. Part of her distaste of mathematics formalism may have been because it tended to oversimplify in her eyes the content of the theory in question. One author notes that she seems to be in fact embrace the messiness and fuzzy thinking non-mathematical treatment of the subject alone. In her mind, it seems the tool of mathematics was a tool too precise to make sense of the nebulous reality of the real markets. Robinson seems skeptical about the contributions of formal reasoning when it comes to stability analysis, or more generally to the analysis of the situations where expectations fail to be fulfilled. In Robinson 1962, for instance, she concludes a verbal analysis of the effect of changes in wages and prices with this comment: these various effects of changes in money wage rates play across the various real movements discussed here. This makes the operation of the model complicated and confusing. That, however, is a merit, not a defect, since it corresponds to reality. The author goes on to argue that Robinson at times thought mathematical formalism to be entirely unnecessary and at times entirely toothless. Robinson in 1979 argues that mathematical logic is a powerful tool of thought, but its application in economic theory generally seems to consist merely of putting circular arguments into algebra. Alternatively, formal analysis may be powerless. Disturbing events occur on disequilibrium paths. The resulting turbulence is beyond the skill of model builders to analyze. Historical analysis can be made only in very general terms. These three criticisms of mathematical formalism in economic theory, of the use of equilibrium concept, and of the confusion between real and imagined methodological time are deep critics of the Neoclassical project. These questions have inspired much debate over the years since then, and though mainstream economists have changed its tune, the criticism has forced many of its practitioners to look twice in the direction they may never have looked once. Perhaps that is the greatest contribution of John Robinson to modern economics. She defines an outside to mainstream theory, showed its limitations, and held up the mirror to all those who come after. If one day a new way of doing economics comes to the fore, it will owe much to the resilience and the tenacity of the few like Robinson and Sraffa. Now let us summarize what we have discussed in this module. The history of capital controversy enhances our understanding as economists of the limitations of the analytical tools. There are three prime examples. The first is the limitation of aggregate production functions with their lack of sound micro foundations for explaining factor prices and for applied econometric work. Aggregate production functions have strengths but also weaknesses. Second is the limitation of equilibrium tools for explaining economic activity where history and path dependence matter. And third is the limitation of simple models for settling complex controversies. Such controversies exist around continuity or discontinuity in the history of economics and around the differences among underlying visions of school of economic thought, whether they be orthodox and heterodox or real business cycle and the new Keynesian varieties of macroeconomic theory. That's all with this module. Thank you.